This is Kim Hammer with your devotion taken from 2 Samuel chapter 5. Sometimes people get in the way of the Lord's will, and God is more than capable of dealing with those people who interfere with his will being carried out. Such is the case we find here in this chapter. We find that David at the age of 30 began to be king over Judah, and for 7.5 years he reigned as king over Judah. And then in this chapter we find that the inhabitants of the nation of Israel, with Saul having died, his kids having been removed, those who would have asserted themselves into the position of king that God took care of, we find that the nation of Israel now decides that they want to come together and join as one with Judah and make David king over the entire nation of Israel. And that's exactly what happened. And we find that for 33 years, he ruled over the combined nation of Judah and Israel for a total of 40 years. In all of this, David found that as these individuals came together to make him king, there was still one problem that had to be dealt with that was standing in the way of the will of the Lord, and it was the Jebusites. They occupied the city of Jerusalem. When David went up to the city of Jerusalem, they hurled insults at him and said, "Even our blind and even our lame will defeat you if you're able to make it in the city." Well, David didn't take the route of trying to break down the doors to go into the city, and he didn't try to go over the walls or to break the walls down. Instead, he displayed his strategic military capabilities, in that he said, if we're going to get into the city of Jerusalem, we're going to have to go through the water shaft that supplies the water to the city of Jerusalem. And that's exactly what he did. And when he got into the city with his men, he defeated the Jebusites and annihilated them, and he was able to take his place as king in the city of Jerusalem. All the enemy around that watched what had happened both prior to this, but especially during this, sent gifts to David, which was pretty smart on their part, because now they were realizing that the hand of God was on David in order that the will of God might be carried out. And they wanted to make sure that they were going to live in peace with David as he ruled from the city of Jerusalem. So much so that some of the kings sent the materials in order to provide unto David a house to be built for him to reside in. The one thing we also want to notice, though, is this: that God does have the capability of removing people who stand in the way of his will being carried out. That could be you, that could be me, that could be a nation, that could be any entity that gets in the way of God's will being carried out. But the one thing that David learned through all of this, and people recognize through all of this, is found in verse 10. For in verse 10 it says, "And he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him." That should be the goal that we should aspire to have. That we would want to become more and more powerful in the will of God, because we know that the presence of God is with us. The greater the presence of God in our life, the greater the power of God will prevail in our life, and we will look for God's will. We will not stand in the way of God's will, but we will be used at the will of God in order to achieve what brings him honor and glory and praise, just like it did in this chapter.